I have known Jim Jackson and his wife Melinda for something like 35 years. I think he is currently a geology professor at Portland State, and he worked for 20 years as a petroleum geologist for Atlantic Richfield in London and also in Dallas, and maybe other places too that I don't even know about. He's also the author of America from the Air, A Guide to the Landscape Along Your Route, which was co-authored with Dan Matthews and is published by Houghton Mifflin. And it's a book, but it also has a CD that you can play as you're flying on the major cross-country airline routes. And you can look down and you can say, oh, what's that? And you can look on the CD and it'll tell you what you're looking at, which is pretty cool. And so I would like to introduce Jim Jackson.
That I'm part of a large army of geologists and other specialties, and it also means, most importantly, I don't have to go to meetings. If there's anything worse than an academic reading, reading the government. Okay, this is the Yates oil field. It was the first oil field found west of Pecos. It was found at a time when...
Jim, the mic may not be on, or it may not be close enough to your mouth.
Hello, microphone.
That's good. There.
I'm one of these people who walks around though when he talks, so I don't know that I'll be on this microphone with regularity. I'm also one of these people who doesn't like the sound of his own voice. Anyway, this is the Ira Ann, Texas. Ira Ann is there. It's out in far west Texas. If you go there at noon, you will find all the town officials in one place playing game of cards or dominoes. These officials include the county sheriff, the county prosecutor, and the sole county judge. So whenever I drove through Iran, I made a point of finding the speed limit and traveling no more than 2 miles above or below it, because I knew you had no chance as a defendant. The Iran field, when it was discovered, was far removed from oil and gas facilities around Houston. And so moving this oil to Houston was very problematic. And the oil companies around the state were finding more and more oil, and they persuaded the state of Texas to regulate the flow of oil. And the state had an entity that regulated commodities. It was the Texas Railroad Commission. The Railroad Commission had been founded because farmers and ranchers were paying onerous tolls to get their produce to market. And so for in-state railroads, the state entity was created to provide tariffs. And they subsequently began to regulate oil fields initially so that everybody would have access to a pipeline, and subsequently so that good oil field practices would be followed. More of this in a bit. Okay, one of the neat things about giving talks is you get to say thanks to people who've helped you along the way. Most of what you hear is the product of a 20-year career in the oil business and a 10-year academic career, multiple conversations with a number of people, but most of them were employed by ARPA. And I'd like to acknowledge that group. Wish they were here to drink beer afterwards. Here's an outline of the talk. There's an introduction, not noted. Oil and gas in the subsurface. How does this stuff work? Refining. I'm going to talk about crude oil, but of course none of us, unless we own refineries, care about crude oil. We really care about the products that are made from crude oil, most notably gasoline. And so to understand this whole oil thing, you really, with any insight at all, you have to understand refining. So we'll chat about that a bit. The inspiration for all peak oil talks is M. King Hubbard. So I'll talk about his peak oil concept, which he developed in the 50s as a geologist working at Shell. It was a planning exercise for Shell. Following his retirement with Shell, he went to the USGS and did similar work for another 20 years. But I contend that whatever happens with oil production in the future, it's not due to some oil god in the sky making a decision, or everybody rousing up at once, having a sudden insight into the scarcity or coming scarcity of this commodity. It's going to be the product of many local decisions made on the basis of local priorities. And so I want to talk about oil more as local geology, local politics, local economics, rather than a global problem. And then we'll reach some tentative conclusions, and if there's time and interest, then there's an appendix or an addendum. If you really want to know about petroleum systems and how oil forms, what we think we're doing when we look for it, I've got a bit of that called petroleum systems. If you're interested in Western European gas and the stranglehold the Russians would love to have upon the Western European economies, there's a bit on that. And if you're really keen to stay late, we can watch 2 minutes of M. King Hubbard talking about the same subject in much greater detail and a much greater brevity. Okay, so this is an oil and gas reservoir, something like it. Oil and gas does not occur in big containers in the subsurface. It occurs between tiny little voids sitting among sandstone grains or limestone grains. And I've represented them on this cartoon with red for gas, green for oil, and blue for water. So that's where the oil hides, or the gas hides, that's where the oil hides, and this is where the brine is sitting. Brine being water that has dissolved whatever is soluble in the subsurface and is quite ubiquitous with any permeable bed you find in the subsurface. So what we do is we drill a well, we case the well, we cement the casing, not necessarily following the techniques practiced a year ago by British Petroleum. We then puncture the casing, and we begin by puncturing the water, or the oil leg. And then the pressure differential between the subsurface and the surface drives the oil to the surface. And when we've depleted a lot of the oil, and if we have a market for the gas, we then puncture the pipe opposite the gas leg. And then we deplete the gas reservoir. So there are no large containers of oil in the subsurface. There are no dinosaurs cleverly dodging exploration wells. It's really the same tedious stuff that you find out on the beach that gets in your children's eyes, gets in your eyes when it's windy. And sitting between these sand grains or limestone particles, there are little bits of oil. The typical reservoir will have 20 to 25% void space. And so if you have 100 feet of oil column, you've got about 25 feet of actual oil and 75 feet of sand or carbonate or something else. So that's the reality. Okay, on to refining. I used to know people in the refining business. I used to run into them in Midland, in Dallas, and in London, and now I don't. They've all retired. It's an awful business. It's a great way of losing money, and that's why my friends have all retired. They also got old, careless of them. This is what happens. We take oil, crude oil, and we heat it up. And then we run it through a vacuum tube. And we discover in doing this that oil is made of many, many components, at least 75, typically more like 150 individual chemical species. And some of them are quite light, and some of them are quite heavy. So the stuff at the top that comes out at 90 degrees, butane. If you have a butane lighter, that's where it comes from. Below that, between 90 and 220 degrees, we get a series of hydrocarbon compounds that we would all call straight gasoline. This is the gasoline that was originally used in automobiles 100 years ago. Since then, automobile engines have become more sophisticated, and air pollution requirements have been incorporated, and so we now have a very different thing than straight run gasoline, but you could in principle run that fraction of the oil through your automobile. Then we get naphtha, which occasionally you'll see reports of. It's processed into gasoline and other products. Below that we get kerosene, and I suspect some of you play with kerosene whenever the power goes out. I used to play with it quite a bit. And then we get light gas oil. Light gas oil is something that can be used in a diesel engine. It can certainly be used as bunker fuel. And below that we get something which we can only extract by first heating oil and then running it through a vacuum. We have to reduce the pressure to keep the stuff mobile. And these things are heavy gas oil and residual fuel oil and asphalt. And this is where asphalt comes from. It's a small fraction of oil and gas. Now, not every oil has the same range of composition or the same proportions of oil, of components. And I'm sure you've heard of API. API is American Petroleum Institute. They were originally founded to provide a unified standard for pipelines. And they describe oil in terms of API gravity, and this is actually a measure of viscosity of oil. But it turns out the API gravity is also a function of the composition. And when you take oils of approximately the same API and you run them through a standard refinery, you tend to get the same product yields. So you see on the right we have API 42, and you run it through a standard refinery, and you get a great volume of gasoline. And a little bit of middle distillates, a tiny amount of heavy fuel oil. As you work towards smaller API numbers, which happens to be more dense oils with lower viscosity, you get less and less gasoline. You get a bit more of the distillates, the diesel fuels and the jet fuels, and you begin to get more and more of the heavy oils, more and more of the asphalts. So here's our API 42. We love this stuff if we're in the gasoline business. We get a lot of it. API 23, we only get about 15% gasoline running it through a refinery. And we will come back to this. This has major implications for where the oil industry or where the transportation industry are going. Okay, we also characterize oil in terms of the sulfur content. And some oils have a lot of sulfur. This is a problem, so you have to remove the sulfur. And when you're processing high sulfur crudes, you are incurring a cost which has to be passed on to somebody. You're also liberating a lot of sulfur into the environment, which has to be found, either disposed of or found a place for in the chemical processing industry. The oils that you've probably heard of are WTI, West Texas Intermediate, and perhaps Brent. These are what we call light crudes. They have high APIs and very low sulfur content. And if you've heard of the Athabascan tar sands in Canada or the Orinoco tar sands in Venezuela, these are low APIs. They basically are something that is so dense it will sink in water. Anything below API 10 will sink in water. And they also happen to have high sulfur content. So this is the Venezuelan tar. This is the Athabascan tar. If you're going to get gasoline out of these low API oils, you're going to have to use a lot of natural gas to supplement the processing stream. So just because we have a lot of oil, if it's mostly low API tar sand oil, it's not going to work in our chemical industry the way the light crudes are working today. 1980, the average composition in the U.S. was shown here. Today, it says 2005, but I looked it up last week. We're still processing about the same quality of crudes that we were processing in 2005. A little bit about refinery utilization. From time to time, people will say, oh, we have a crisis, we don't have enough refineries, or, oh dear, our refineries are only running at 80% capacity. Actually, 80% is kind of the norm, somewhere between 80 and 90. When you have a refinery which is designed for a particular oil field, and the oil field is large, and you can get all the oil from that field that you need to run the refinery, you can run the refinery at 105, 108% capacity. And for about 15 years, the refinery that ARCO has up in Puget Sound was running about 105% capacity. They were bringing oil from Prudhoe Bay Field down the pipeline, then into a tanker, into the Puget Sound area, and they never had to turn off the refinery to retrofit it or change its configuration for a different kind of crude. But if you start mixing different kinds of crudes into your refinery, then you have more and more downtime and your refinery efficiency falls. This is something to keep in mind. Okay, now why do we care about oil? Just how big a deal is oil? This is a chart that the Department of Energy puts out. They have changed their format, and I don't like their new format, so I'm using their old format. And owing to the recession in 2008, these numbers are the same numbers we have today. So this is a good proxy for 2010, probably a good proxy for 2011, and this is U.S. production. We have two sources of oil. We have the oil that we import and the oil that we produce. So this is imported oil, and this this is oil that we produce. And the numbers are about 2 to 1. 2 barrels are imported for every barrel we produce nationally. And then there are some other oils that come in from other places and go out. We export a little bit to Canada, we export a little bit to Mexico. There's a certain amount of economic incentive to do these local exchanges. And then we run it through the refineries, and we put it into different kinds of uses. And as you can see, transportation is the biggest use of our crude oil. That's followed by industrial uses, and everything else is pretty trivial, including residential heating. Okay, so where does oil fit amongst all the other energy sources that we use in the U.S.? This is coal, natural gas, U.S. crude oil, imported crude oil, nuclear energy, renewable energy, solar, and hydropower. So crude oil, and the total supply that we use is about 100 quadrillion BTUs. Nobody knows what a quadrillion BTUs is. It's a number which is unimaginably large. I think to get 1 quadrillion BTUs out of a coal-fired power plant, you need about, I think it's 5 coal-fired power plants of the size we have at Boardman. So these are really quite big numbers, and most people I talk to really have no intuition for them. So of this 100 quadrillion BTUs, let's see, crude oil is 10 quads from the U.S. and 28, almost 29 quads imported. So that's about 40% of our energy supply is crude oil. The nuclear industry supplies about 8%. Coal, about 25%, natural gas, about 20%. And so oil is a big deal. It's going to be very difficult to walk away from it at all quickly. Okay, on to M. King Hubbert. As I said, he worked for Shell. He was a geologist. He was apparently quite a brilliant man. We had a guy at ARCO who we brought in as the vice president for exploration. He was at Shell their youngest chief geologist. And his favorite employee as a chief geologist at Shell was M. King Hubbert. And Marlon used to tell me that he'd go over to Hubbert's office on Monday every week, ask him what he was doing, and ask him what he needed. Hubbert was the sort of bright guy where you didn't have to tell him anything. You just asked him what he was interested in, what you could do to help. And when I was a student 30 years ago, Hubbert was not known for being an economic geologist or petroleum economist. He was known for being a very fine structural geologist and a very fine subsurface fluid flow analyst. Easy to say. And it turns out that this work on oil supplies was just a little side thing that he did on behalf of the planning department. And when he came out of Shell, he made some presentations in his first years as a USGS geologist, and they were rejected quite enthusiastically by the most important economic geologists in the country, by most of the legislators representing Texas and Oklahoma. That's literally true. And nobody liked his analysis. He first made it in 1956. That's the earliest one he was allowed to publish. These charts are from congressional testimony he made in 1969. And they show his 56 forecast. Now, one of the problems that he had, that he documented very clearly, was how much oil, when oil peaks is a function of how much oil we have. And it was rather unclear in 1956 how much oil we had in the lower 48, so he made 3 different forecasts. A small forecast, a somewhat larger forecast, and a way bigger forecast. And then he took the same technique and he applied it to the world. And for that he only published 1 forecast, and he knew that was silly, and he really didn't want anybody to dwell on it. Okay, we'll come back to these in a minute. A lot of people who talk about peak oil, you get excited, will say, Well, this analysis that Hubbard does is a logistics curve, and it derives from petroleum engineering, and that bell-shaped curve is very much the kind of curve that we use when we forecast the production of an oil field. And this is an oil field in the North Sea, and it shows forecasts for the original field as well as some extensions, and you can see that it has the bell-shaped curve shape. And I know about this because we tried to farm into it, and I did an analysis of this field in 1982. It took me about a week to discover it was really big, and it took us about 2 weeks to discover we didn't have the money to buy in. But the forecast was really quite good. They said their field would peak, the original field would peak in 1993, and it actually did. And they said the whole complex would be ready for abandonment in 2016, and it will be. And this work was done in the early 80s. So it's a very robust technique. It is not, however, the one that Hubbard uses. Hubbard had data. He was trying to find a formula that fit the curves that he was using. And then somebody said, you ought to go look at the biology literature. They have something called a logistics curve that kind of matches what you're talking about. And he did. And he fit it to the data he had and made his projections. And then somebody else at Shell said, oh, what field are you looking at? Hubbard said, oh, I'm looking at the whole world. Turns out the engineers were using the same methodology. Ron Carpenter works for the USGS. He's in their assessment group, and every now and again he sits down and he looks at Hubbard's work, and then he updates his own estimate of how much oil we found and where we are on the Hubbard curve. I talked to him a couple of years ago about this, asked him if he was going to do it anytime soon. He said, no, the 2005 reassessment was the last one he would do for quite a while. So this is what things looked like 5 years ago. This is the lower 48 production, and it's of the three curves, it's the biggest. And so Hubbard made his prediction here. He predicted a peak about here, roughly 1970. And sure enough, it did peak in 1970. And the decline curve that he showed, or forecast, has very much been the decline curve that we're following. Now there is some rugosity. There are some fluctuations about the curve because we have recessions and we have manic periods when the price of oil is low, and so sometimes we're producing and consuming more oil than he forecast, and sometimes we're producing less. But over the time span of 1890 to about 2010, you have to say it's an awfully good curve. This is his world curve. He thought if we had 21, we use American use, 2.1 trillion barrels of oil to consume, then we would have peaked about now. The consensus is that we have maybe 3.5 trillion. So his estimate in 1956 was rather short of the mark. But we are marching towards some kind of peak, don't know when. Lots of other people have looked at this and have said, well, I like Hubbard's technique, I just have to get better data and do an update. So these are several updates, and let's see, the one which has probably gotten the most publicity is Ken DeFay's analysis. He wrote a book called The View from Hubbard's Peak, which was a revision to an earlier book he wrote, which was called Hubbard's Peak. And he worked for Shell, and then he went to Princeton and taught geology at Princeton for quite a while. And he made some estimates about published reserves that he thought were better than the published reserves based on conversations he had with students, past students, people in the industry. And he basically said the peak oil would occur in about 2005. So this is the DeFay's curve right there. And he forecasted disaster in about 3 years' time. He wasn't worried about politics. There are some other straight lines on here. These are the sort of lines some economists like to make. Basically, they're extrapolating the production trends to about there. And then they're saying, well, if you look at production trends, we have a growth in consumption, and we might see that the growth in consumption is growing at 1% per year, or maybe it's growing at 2% per year. And these lines are instructive because they give you an idea of just how different the world looks with infinite growth. some kind of constraint. And of course, there are some other analyses, and really what they all assume is different volumes of oil to be produced. These are two slightly more recent analyses, and these make a little bit more clear what's going on with these very optimistic forecasts. The upper one is made by the American Association of Petroleum Geologists. It was published in a paper in 2007. They were going to document their technique and all of their assumptions, and as of yesterday, they had not published that documentation. I'm not sure what's going on, if it's something in the review process or if somebody just hasn't had the time. But what they've done is they've said, well, we might have low resources, we might have medium resources, we might have high resources, and it's a function of several things. The biggest and most important one being price. At $15 in oil, there's a limit to how much oil we can produce. At $150 a barrel, there's a lot more oil we can produce. And they're trying to represent that with these three curves. And of course, they're fairly optimistic. This is really when they made the forecast. And the curves really don't depart until about 2015. And then the optimistic curve, it peaks here at 2040. The pessimistic curve peaks at 2020. And then we start coming off of these production plateaus anywhere from 2040 to 2070. Now what they're not breaking out in this curve is what kind of oil they're producing. They're just saying under different price assumptions, certain kinds of oil can come into the market and we can't produce it, and then refiners will deal with that reality. CERA is Dan Yergin's group. They're now affiliated with something called IHS, which is just this big holding company of different consultancies. Yergin's group have a lot of subscribers. The subscribers entertain Yergin once a year. He comes to their office, or his staff comes to their office. They tell Exxon and Shell how they see the world. And then over beer or whiskey, Exxon and Shell people tell Yergin how Exxon and Shell see the world. And a year later, when Yergin comes back, he quotes back to Exxon and Shell what he's heard from Exxon and Shell and other companies. So there's a certain positive feedback there. It's an interesting way to make a living. But they have got a point in this analysis that I rather like. They divide the world into conventional oil and unconventional oil. They make some other divisions, but for our purposes, this is conventional oil, this is unconventional oil, and the peaks are a little bit different, but the volume of oil that's available is much greater if you count unconventional oil. Now, unconventional oil is that oil down there at 10 API, stuff with the high sulfur that yields not much gasoline, a whole lot of asphalt. Now, economists like to say oil is a fungible commodity, but when you start thinking about what happens with different oils going through a refinery, you begin to wonder if this business of fungibility is maybe not the complete story. Okay, well, how can so many people have so many different ideas about how much oil is left? And they're all bright, they all work really hard at it. Some of them are quite passionate and driven to analyze it. And I think if we tear apart the Hubbard curve and the kind of data that goes into it, we begin to see what that problem is. So here's the curve, and it has four parts. There's the oil that's been produced. And I think we know how much oil has been produced. There's really no reason to lie about how much oil you've produced. And those numbers are pretty reliable, and they're so big that if there's an error bar, it's pretty tiny. And then there's the oil that's been discovered. This is called proven reserves. Now, to a banker, a proven reserve is a barrel of oil that you can demonstrate to the banker's satisfaction is sitting in the subsurface and can be used as collateral. So that's a fairly stringent standard. And then there's undiscovered oil. That's the oil we haven't found yet. We hope to find by spending money drilling wells. So those are the three obvious things. And then the one which is not talked about in any of the discussions I've seen, save two, is the shape of the curve. What is that supply-demand curve really going to look like? Because that bell-shaped curve that's really the product of many supply-demand decisions. Now let's look at each one of these things. Let's assume we know how much oil has been produced. I think that's not worth arguing about. But here's some information that's possibly new to you. A lot of oil is found in just a few fields. These are the 14 largest fields in the world. Ghawar is the big field in Saudi Arabia. Original reserves in place, about 100 billion barrels that could be recovered. About 70 billion remain to be produced. And one of the facts that the negative assessors, the negative forecasters like to make is that we don't really know how much oil is in Ghawar. The Saudis are not telling us. And therefore, we must take a more conservative view of Ghawar and cut its reserves by perhaps half. And if we do that, then there's much less oil in the world. The Bergen field, that's Kuwait. That's the one big oil field in Kuwait. Safaniya is Iran. Bolivar is the big field in Venezuela. Then we have Azerbaijan, which is, God, it's in the Caspian area. I forget which country it's in. Beri, Rumallah, Abku, Zakum, Manifa, Kirkuk, Sheba, Ghazaran. Obviously, those are all Persian or Arabic names, badly pronounced this time. And then in the middle there was Cantarell. Cantarell's a field in Mexico. We'll talk about that in a bit. These are recent discoveries. This, again, has been compiled by CERA, the IHS group, and it shows discoveries from 2000 to 2008. These numbers are pretty good. You could probably do this analysis today. I think there's enough published information, and you would revise all of these numbers up a little bit, and you'd probably toss in one recent discovery in Iraq. Brazil has been the most prolific place to find oil, and most of it's been found in very deep water. Water is as deep as the BP spill, possibly deeper. Some gas has been associated with that. They've found 22 billion barrels of oil there, which is about half again the size of all the oil we expect to get out of Prudhoe Bay. Basically, they found another North Slope, just offshore, 2-hour helicopter ride. China has found quite a bit of gas and a bit of oil, mostly out in the west for the oil. Most of the gas has been found offshore. Kazakhstan, that's the big field whose name I couldn't remember. 15 billion barrels of oil, that's a significant discovery. Iran is proving to be a much more gassy country than people thought. Russia has had success finding gas rather than oil. The U.S., most of those oil discoveries are in deep water in the Gulf of Mexico. This is what the EP is looking for. And so on down the list. Now, the other thing on this chart that's worth thinking about are the average discovery size. Once upon a time, we used to go out systematically looking for fields that were 1 billion barrels or more in likely reserves. And one could look seismic in undiscovered, unexplored basins, incredibly think about billion-barrel fields. And that was 1970, 1980, 1985. Along about 1990, we stopped looking for billion-barrel fields because we just weren't seeing them in the seismic data. So these numbers, for the last 8 years, 800 million in Kuwait, that's average field size, and that's oil equivalent, so we're taking gas and doing a conversion to convert cubic feet of gas into oil. Iran, 750 million barrels equivalent. Kazakhstan, 500 million barrels equivalent. Ghana, 373 million barrels of oil, and that is mostly oil. And most disappointingly, Saudi Arabia, 233 million barrels of oil equivalent. And yes?
Am I understanding correctly that this represents new oil? It does not represent increased production or extraction capacity from
this? Exactly. Is this new oil? Yes, this is new oil. This is not improvements in engineering techniques. This is not a result of higher prices. This is someplace where nobody had drilled before. They've gone out, they've drilled the well, and they've found a brand new field.
So presumably the proven natural gas reserves for the U.S. are actually considerably higher because of the improved extraction?
Right, and IHS are not talking about the shale gas in this at all, nor the coal bed methane. That's a different matter. We've only got an hour and a half. We can talk about that, but that's we'll know the talk. The Saudi business is really quite disturbing. shown a number of people who went to work for Saudi Aramco. Some of them were working for Saudi Aramco in the 70s, some in the 80s. And those people came back from their 5 years in Saudi saying, you know, it's just amazing. You look at all the prospects they have, and they're only drilling the biggest ones. They're billion-barrel prospects, and it's like you're in the mountain range, and you only see the peaks. But you know below the clouds, there are many, many, many more fields, and they're all very big. And Saudi, about 10 years ago, embarked on a fairly aggressive exploration program. Not as aggressive as the Saudi government says, but by most standards, they spent a lot of money to open the wells. And they have not been finding big fields. They've been finding relatively small fields, especially for the part of the world that they're in. And this does give me pause. Okay, global oil reserves. Now we're going to get into some of the problems that the negative assessors have with the numbers of proven reserves. This is from BP. Every year they publish a statistical review, and they give you a snapshot of recent discoveries, and they put it in a historic context. So here we have 1984, 1994, and 2004.
1984, Middle East oil.
About 420 billion barrels. 1994, the Middle East suddenly had 50% more oil. And actually that jump occurred between 1984 and 1986. The price of oil had been running around $30 a barrel, $35 a barrel, depending on the crude you looked at, in the early 80s. And then we had the collapse of oil prices in 85, from 30 down to 15. And members of OPEC looked at each other and they said, I've lied to you. I actually have a lot more oil than I've been telling you. And so when we allocate oil next week, you have to give me a larger share of the OPEC pie because I have more oil. And the OPEC quotas are allocated as a function of your proven reserves. So if we have 100 million barrels and Saudi Arabia has 50 million barrels, then Saudi Arabia, under their rationale, will get half of the OPEC quota. Well, everybody had gotten very accustomed to selling oil for $30 a barrel. And when the world dropped down to $15 a barrel, nobody wanted to go back to having half of that revenue. So Saudi Arabia, leading the way, Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and then Iran all said overnight, oh, we've got a lot more oil. Therefore, our fraction of the OPEC pie must go up. We must be allocated a larger fraction of the quota. And so that's why the reserves jumped by 50%, really in 2 years, not in 5. And everybody who's been looking at this says, no, wait a minute, they weren't doing the exploration during this time frame. Engineering techniques do not improve that much. One does not add oil when the price goes down. One subtracts oil because some oil becomes non-commercial. How is it possible that these countries have got so much more oil now than they used to? And so with this thought in mind, the pessimists have said, clearly the Middle East doesn't have as much oil as we think it does. And so when we make an assessment using a Hubbard curve of how much oil is proved, we must apply some suitable discount. And what most people have done is to go back to the reserves reported circa 1983, and they've said, well, this is it. And if the reserves are growing, they're growing no faster than they are anyplace else in the world. So that's...
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So proven reserves is defined as reserves that you can economically extract. Is that correct?
In the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in Norway.
Okay.
And the U.S. and the United Kingdom are the major sources of project financing in the international oil business. The French also participate. The French banks are just as rigorous as the U.S. banks. In OPEC, they don't have a reserves validation process. What you report is what I will put on the board. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, they're doing every bit of finance through internal cash flow. They're not going to banks, so they don't need that validation process. And that's because Aramco, Saudi Aramco is a state-owned oil company. It's no longer held in trust by 4 oil companies on behalf of the government. So, the main way banks discover the size of an oil field is when somebody comes to them for project finance, and then they do the rigorous analysis. If you're doing everything through internal cash flow, you don't have to show your books to anybody. You're free of that.
Thank you.
Well, this is the way BP like to portray their figures. It's a different way, but these are the same numbers, little balls, or donuts. This is their most recent analysis, and the donuts are getting bigger. The proportions are changing a little bit. Some of the proportions are changing in South America and Central America, here to here to here. And these are primarily the deep water discoveries that are being made offshore Brazil, and some changes in the accounting of Orinoco heavy oil. And BP do not make a distinction amongst conventional oil, heavy oil, light oil. They just report oil as proven reserves, period. There are also some small changes in Africa. Where is Africa? From here to here to here. And these are offshore discoveries being made off of Angola in deep water, Nigeria in deep water, Ghana in deep water. But the bulk of these changes in the actual absolute amount of oil that's recoverable is attributable to improved engineering and higher prices. It's not attributable to exploration. So this is what we call reserve growth. Here we are from 1984, that previous diagram, to 2009. And I've scaled these so they're all approximately the same. By this analysis, you would say, oh gosh, we don't have a problem. Oil is, as George Bush would say, the pie is getting bigger on your family. There it is. Okay, well, those are proven reserves. What about undiscovered oil? Well, this is another chart that M. King Hubbard put together, which other people have adopted. And again, Ron Carpenter has updated. And you can see we had a peak in oil discoveries in the 30s. And that was basically the opening of West Texas more than anything else. And then we have a lull in exploration called World War II. And then after World War II, we have a great peak of discoveries in the late 40s. And that's the discovery of the Middle East oil reserves more than anything else. And then we have another lull in the early 50s, and advancing from 50 to about 68, we have increasing discoveries every year. That's the introduction of seismic processing and seismic acquisition and seismic data. That made a huge difference in how we think about the subsurface. And after about 1968, we have a secular decline until the mid-70s, and the mid-70s represents an advance out into deeper waters in the Gulf of Mexico primarily, and the North Sea. And this is made possible by the movement of the price of oil in response to the two Arab oil embargoes, 1973 and 1978. And since then, even with the West African discoveries, the bar is basically heading to the right, heading down. We're not really looking at any major discoveries, major province discoveries. Okay, so the prospects for finding more oil are not optimistic, but still we'd like to know what that part of the Hubbard analysis looks like, right? So we have to ask ourselves, how much oil remains to be found? Well, the truth is, when we drill a well, an exploration well, usually it's a dry hole. 30% discovery rate is pretty good. 60% discovery rate is rare. A 10% discovery rate in basins that are untested is actually exceptional. So if we want to characterize an untested prospect, we have to assess it in terms of the likelihood of finding oil and then a probability distribution for the oil reserves we might find. So that's two thoughts. Thinking about the whole planet, because we don't know how much oil we're going to find at any given prospect, we have to use probability techniques to characterize undiscovered oil, and this is something the USGS does. And really, nobody else does this. The last time they published an assessment for the entire globe was 2000. Again, Ron Carpenter and his group did that. And when I saw Ron 2 years ago, I asked him when they were going to publish another global assessment. He said, we don't plan to. They're basically doing service projects for individual countries, and they are not aggregating them. So these are the numbers we have, and these are the numbers assessors look at, forecasters look at. And as you'll see in a second, optimistic forecasters choose one number, one range of numbers from the forecast. The pessimists, the ones who think there is no more oil to be found, choose another. Okay? Well, the technique that they apply is they look at each basin, and they say to themselves, well, I wonder how many fields are left to be found in this basin. And they say, well, it might be 10 fields, it might be 0 fields, it might be 50 fields. And so they create a field number distribution. That's what this represents. And then they ask themselves, well, how big might the fields be? Now, the smallest field has to be a commercial field. Doesn't make sense to think about fields you can't produce commercially. So that's the minimum cutoff for each basin, and that varies, where you are in the world. Deep water, that minimum has to be pretty big. Onshore West Texas next to a pipeline, that minimum can be very, very small. So they create a probability distribution for the sizes of different fields, and then they do a Monte Carlo simulation with these two probability distributions, and that results in the forecast. Now, we could go into this in detail, but we don't have 5 hours. This is the result of the forecast, which is all you need to know. That the USGS 10 years ago said there was anywhere from 300 billion barrels left to be found to a very optimistic 1 trillion barrels left to be found, with a mean of about 650. So if you're doing a Hubbard analysis, you've got proven reserves, that constrains the curve in part. You've got produced reserves, you certainly can constrain it with that. And now you have to choose a place on this curve for your undiscovered oil. And if you're a cynic and you think there's nothing more to be found, you're on the left side of this curve, down by 300 billion barrels. And if you're an optimist, you're over on the right side. And if you're a medium kind of person, you might be somewhere around 600. Well, that's an interesting analysis, and it's a shame that the USGS doesn't update it. And it's difficult to get anybody at the USGS to say that they're doing a postmortem on that analysis. I ask them every time I go to a meeting where they're present, and they always refer me to another group. I go to that other group, and they always refer me back to the USGS. So I really don't know if they're doing a postmortem analysis. But this is the basis of a postmortem analysis, and several things are interesting. First of all, in that 2000 assessment, they did not assess offshore Brazil deep water. That is simply not included in the assessment. That is offset by their assessment of Saudi Arabia. To which was attributed considerably more oil than has been found in Brazil. So, do recent discoveries offset one another? Those which the USGS didn't think to analyze because we didn't know the clay was there, we didn't know the sediments were there, or not? Well, we really don't know. We just don't have the data. People tend to hold this data pretty tight. There are quite a few wells that have been drilled in deep water for which no results have been published. And this it just reinforces the ambiguity that we have with undiscovered reserve assessments. Okay, what about the shape of that curve? What should it look like? Well, how do we forecast demand? How do we forecast supply? Can we make a single forecast for that curve? Or should we make useful scenarios? Can we even do that? Well, OPEC not only have a bunch of companies that work for state entities, they also have an office in Vienna, which I'll show you in a minute, and in that office they have economists, and those economists attempt to forecast supply and demand. And this is some of their work, which they publish every year. Number of automobiles in the world. Since oil is primarily a transportation fuel after refining, we should think about that. And so, on the left we have number of cars per 1,000 people. This is us. Right? That's Canada. That's Britain. You march on down through Western Europe. And then you get transition economies, perhaps that's India. In fact, that is India. And then you go down to developing countries, typically less than 200 cars per 1,000 people. 1 person in 5 has a car. And as it turns out, 4.5 billion people live in countries with less than 1 car per 20 people. And it seems to be a good number. The UN has a similar assessment, about the same scale. Well, using that and some other parameters, they make this forecast. Increase the number of passenger cars between 2007 and 2030. In the OECD and transition economies, they see 150 million cars coming. In the Asian developing countries, India, China, Malaysia, Indonesia, they see about 325 million cars. And in other developing countries, they have another 100 million cars plus. Okay, we'll come back to this in a bit. What about product demand? The dark bars show 2009 product sales. 2030 shows OPEC's forecast. And you can see ethane is going to come up a little bit. Naphtha is going to come up quite a bit. Gasoline will go from about 22 million barrels a day to about 25 million barrels a day. But the big kicker is diesel and gas oil, currently about 25 million barrels a day, going up to 35 million barrels a day. Yeah.
Is that, on what assumption of price is that based? Because
You'd have to
demand
look
is a
at their
function of
report.
price, right?
You'd have to look at their report, and I frankly don't remember the mechanics by which they came to these. Here's another comparison of oil demand projections for 2025. So this is just 15 years out. And what they're doing is comparing OPEC's projections with the Energy Information Agency, which is part of the Department of Energy, and the International Energy Agency, which was formed by OECD countries to monitor the oil industry following the first OPEC embargo, Arab oil embargo. So the IEA is based, I think, in Switzerland. OPEC, of course, is in Vienna, and the EIA is in Washington, D.C. And the first thing that strikes you is that between 2005, which is the dark bar on the left, and 2010, which is the light bar on the right, everybody has marked their forecast down. So the economists are generally quite pessimistic in this respect. And they're running from a mean of about 100 million barrels a day down to something closer to perhaps 100 million barrels a day. OPEC has always been slightly more pessimistic than everybody else. The Department of Energy in the U.S. has always been a bit more optimistic. But the most recent forecast, following the 2008 economic collapse, seem to have reached a consensus forecast of about 100 million barrels a day. Now, how they'll feel if we have 5 years of really strong economic growth globally is one thing, and if we go into another deeper recession, perhaps all these numbers will be revised down again. So forecasting is difficult. And I really think we want to make several forecasts for supply and demand, and I'm not an economist, so I don't really know how to do that. But I do know with oil fields, once they peak, they tend to fall off in production. And they tend to fall off very quickly. How quickly they fall off is very much a function of what you've done bringing them up to that peak. Whether you've done a water flood or gas injection. And when you think about global oil, there are several ways to think about how they're going to collapse. Well, this is another group at the Department of Energy, and they said, well, we're going to publish a number of forecasts. I've just chosen one of them. And it says that when we reach peak oil, the fall off of production will follow one particular curve of about 2% per year. And they've also said 2% per year growth, and then say a 10% per year in decline. I have to get that right. And then they've looked at the USGS numbers and they've said, you know, we really don't know how much oil there is. So what we're going to do is take the 5% case, the mean case, and the 95% case, add those to what we think are proven reserves, and see how those play out. So here's their low case, their high case, the middle case rather, and their most optimistic case. And then they have the same decline curve. As I said, they've published other assessments with different decline curves, but they all come to about the same thing. That if we take the USGS and we're not too critical about the proven reserves, this analysis suggests we're going to see a peak of some sort by 2025 under the pessimistic scenario, Under the optimistic scenario, we'll have a peak no later than 2050. Well, of course, this is 2011, so that's not a huge time window.
Can we back up just a second? I'm still struggling with the previous slide. I'm correct with this slide.
Yeah.
So you're saying this is expectations for world demand for oil.
For oil, 2025. Right.
Given what we know about increasing population in the developing countries, I mean, my goodness, Japan or China's automobile consumption, this just seems to fly in the face of.
Well, these are forecasts, and where we are right now is down here. Right, this is where we're going to be 15 years from now from my starting point in this vicinity. So we're seeing an increase. Some people are, a few years ago, not very long ago, we're seeing quite a dramatic increase. And following the 2008 recession, they are still seeing an increase, but not such a dramatic increase. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is not what the answer is, but how difficult it is to come to an answer.
Well, especially when nobody's outside the U.S., Norway, and Great Britain is really divulging true reserves.
No, the Canadians are.
That leaves an awful lot of unknown.
Well, given that most of the oil is in the Middle East, it does pose a problem. It really does. Well, anyway, this is the analysis. If you look at the optimist and the pessimist, you know, DeFay says the peak happened 5 years ago. Under most optimistic scenarios, 35, 40 years from now, we hit the peak, and then we go into some kind of decline, and there is some argument about the shape of that decline. This is all I want to say about global peak forecasts. I'm not a real fan of these because I don't think that when we think about policy response, global peak forecasts have anything to do with what anybody is going to decide. But if you're going to make these forecasts, you have to recognize that they are multidisciplinary. Somebody comes to you and says, I'm an engineer and I've made a forecast. You have to ask who the collaborators were. If there are no collaborators, it's probably not a very good forecast. Precise forecasts, I think, are problematic for a number of reasons. We don't know how much oil is there, we don't know how much oil is going to be found, and we really don't know how much oil is going to be consumed 5, 6, 10 years from now. And frankly, I don't think we know how these oil fields are going to respond to the engineering techniques that are applied in various price environments. And we really can't forecast the price with any sensibility. There is another problem, though, and this one is global in nature, and it comes back to the composition of the oil that is being produced. Because the U.S. has had a gasoline bias in its transportation, we have been consuming preferentially a lot of light crude. We are about to exhaust light crude supplies. There's just a lot less of it. And in the future, and this really is the next 25 years, we're going to see more and more heavy crudes consumed, more and more sulfur-rich crudes consumed, so the refining process will become much more expensive. And the yields out of those refineries, unless we spend a lot of money using natural gas to upgrade these crudes, is going to move from the mean of about, I guess the mean right now is about 30%, 28% gasoline from a standard run, towards the 15% gasoline run. And knowing that this is happening, you do think, well, if I was king for a day and I was going to do something with our transportation fleet, I would wean us from gasoline. I would move to some other fuel if I was committed to staying with the oil industry. And one of the things I think we're seeing with Libya right now is that Libya does produce primarily a very light crude. It goes to the refineries, and you can treat it to create a tremendous volume of diesel, which is what the Italian refineries do. Or if you bring it to the United States, as some companies were doing 2 months ago, you can get quite a bit of gasoline out of it. But Libyan oil is not on the market right now, and it's not much that they've taken out. They've only lost 1.5 million, maybe 2 million a day. And there is an excess supply of crude on the market. The Saudis have put a lot of offers to tanker crude to people, but Saudi crude is a little bit more sulfur-rich, and it has a lower API. And when you run it through a refinery, you don't get the yields that the Italians are getting or that the Americans are getting that have been using Libyan crude. And the Saudis are finding they can't sell these incremental barrels. The market isn't there. Okay, on to the remaining theme of this talk. All geology is local. Kevin Burke was one of the founders of Plate Tectonics, and he wrote this line in a book review, and I like it. Oil is our patrimony. I spent a week in La Paz and Santa Cruz, Bolivia, trying to speak Spanish with a Bolivian colleague. And at the end of the week, we developed a pretty good rapport, and I suddenly discovered he speaks better English than I speak Spanish. He looks at me over a parting cup of coffee, and he says, Jim, I've really enjoyed working with you, and I hope that you will come back. But you must know, oil is our patrimony. It's our inheritance from our great-great-great-grandparents. Not to be trifled with. Okay, so we'll talk about that context in the next few slides. There are a number of countries that have actually peaked in their oil production. So this is a real phenomenon. The United States, United Kingdom, Indonesia, Egypt, France, Argentina, Iran, and yes, Russia. Russia used to produce 14 million barrels a day. Now they produce about 10. There's OPEC. Every time I see an ad in the paper for a petroleum geologist employed in Vienna, I think, that might be fun for a few years. And then I look at the OPEC building and I think, no, not with any regularity. Okay, OPEC is a consortium of countries. Saudi Arabia and Venezuela were the founders. And there was a fellow, Juan Alfonso Perez, a Venezuelan economist. He studied the Texas Railroad Commission, and he thought it represented a good model for oil exporting countries. And in 1956, he proposed the formation of OPEC, and the proposal was roundly rejected, first by Saudi Arabia and then by everybody else. In 1960 or 61, Chevron told the Saudis that the price of oil that they were giving them was going to be reduced by 7 cents a barrel. This was back when oil was about 90 cents a barrel. And the Saudis didn't like this. And then one of the major producers in Venezuela went to the Venezuelans and said, we're reducing your price by 3 cents a barrel. Look what we've done to Saudis. You'll have to live with it. And so the Venezuelans called the Saudis, and the Saudis, when they picked up the phone, said, I know why you're calling. Thus was OPEC born. Some countries have come in and gone out of OPEC. Indonesia was exporting oil for quite a while, and they remained in OPEC until they were importing oil. And finally, it became clear that they would never rejoin the exporting group. Angola is a recent addition. Ecuador is always on the margin in and out in terms of its actual production. Okay, I have to distract you a little bit. You've heard about my interaction with the Bolivian. Especially in light of recent events, I am reminded of some conversations I had while traveling to North Africa and the Middle East. And really what I'm reminded of is the history of this region. And if you've seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia, there's one scene in the tent where it's made pretty clear. Dan?
Yeah.
This is a map of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was a Turkish empire. It was not a Middle Eastern or North African empire. It was a Turkish empire. I've known several Iranians who, when we got really familiar with each other, would say to me, and they all did, they said, my family's not really from Iran, we are from Turkey. Their great-grandparents immigrated to Iran during the Ottoman Empire. In 1683, it controlled a large part of the world. You know, we had the Lawrence of Arabia movie, where some Arab families joined with the British, and their goal was to chase the Turks out of Arabia and out of the Middle East. That's really what their motivation was. They wanted to establish democracy. They wanted to run the place themselves. They wanted to get rid of these Turks. I have heard this from several people who are well placed. So this is the Sykes-Picot Agreement, arranged by two bureaucrats, one from France and one from Britain. They basically divided the world into protectorates. Let's see, well, this doesn't show all of them. Anyway, the French, the reason why Beirut is called the Paris of the Med, it was a French protectorate, and the French, to the extent that they had influence in Beirut, attempted to recreate a French capital there. Some of this is British. Some of it is Russian. And there's some other influence, but we have to move on. Before World War II, France had a real colony in North Africa. Libya was an Italian colony. The Brits had large parts of Sudan and Egypt and other bits of the Middle East. And of course, after World War II, the world was reapportioned again. Libya was now a Franco-British trust. The Sudan was British trust after a fashion. India was still British, but not for much longer. And of course, today the world looks like this. Well, these countries really don't like this colonial history. They'd like to get rid of it. And I think in making some of their decisions, especially OPEC, membership in OPEC, one of the things that was in the background of men and women whose grandparents had been operating under a colonial regime, a Turkish colonial regime, their thoughts were, we are done being colonies. And we want to organize our lives and our affairs so we will never again be colonies. So let's look at who's in OPEC and who hasn't been. Saudi Arabia, former colony. Venezuela, former colony, liberated by OIL. Iran, former colony. Iraq, former colony. Kuwait, former colony. Qatar was a crucial state, quasi-independent. UAE, likewise. Niger, British colony. Colombia, Spanish colony. Indonesia, a Dutch and British colony at different times. Algeria, a department of France until 1962. Angola, a Portuguese colony. Ecuador, another British colony. Major countries with major production that never thought to join OPEC. Soviet Union, subsequently Russia, Canada, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Mexico. Of course, Mexico has a problematic relationship with the United States, so that might have been difficult in many ways. Okay, a few more words about OPEC. These are OPEC forecasts. Crude and other sources of liquids in their so-called references. They have a number of cases. This is OPEC production until about 2010. This is the forecast. This is non-OPEC production. They forecast increasing OPEC production to 2030. They also see a growth in non-OPEC. Some things to say about OPEC and then move on so we can all go home. It is modeled on the Texas Railroad Commission. This is really true. It comprises several post-colonial states, and I think that fact informs much of their policy. Every one of these countries is young. Now, Qatar less so, UAE maybe less so. The others is surely true. The majority of the population, the mean of the population is youthful, less than 25 years old. Poorly educated, this is absolutely the case, except maybe Tunisia is not in OPEC. But the education levels are problematic across these countries. Underemployment among the young is enormous. 30, 40, 50% unemployment among men and women under the age of 25 is not uncommon. Presently, these countries control all the world's spare production capacity. Nobody else has any capacity shut in. And most of that shut-in capacity is in Saudi Arabia. Kuwait has some. Iran has some. Arguably, Iraq has some. Looking at the scenarios that we just went through way quickly, OPEC does not envision increasing or forecast increasing production from its own lands in its global forecast. They have some production, but they don't plan to make up major shortfalls. It's not something they're going to do. 10 years ago, if you asked somebody from Saudi Arabia about OPEC's ability to offset falling non-OPEC production, that Saudi person would have said, yeah, we can do it. Today, they do not say that. And I think the internal political pressures are going to divert revenues from the oil and gas industry to other areas. You know, they have to address these demographic concerns. It's much more important for them to do that. They're making enough money with the oil. They don't need incremental money from oil. What they need to do is address their social and political concerns. So that's where they're going to spend the money, and that's why they're not planning to offset a major decline in non-OPEC production. They're just not going to do it. It's no longer in their interest. Okay, let's look at Mexico quickly. 2005, it produced 3.4 million barrels a day, as it had done for quite a long time. Last year, it produced 2.4 million. That's a major decline, 1 million barrels a day. It used to export 1.6 million barrels a day to the U.S. Now it exports about 1.1 million barrels a day, and it seems unlikely that they'll be exporting 500,000 barrels a day to the U.S. in 10 years. Production is declining in Mexico. Pemex controls or contributes 40% of state revenues. Almost half of the money the government gets comes from the state oil company. One field, Cantarell, 5 years ago it contributed 57% of Pemex's revenues, almost a quarter of national revenues. Cantarell last year contributed 24% of Pemex revenue. This field is on a dramatic decline, as you'll see. Here's the production. This is some data that I collected in 2005, and it included a forecast. Here's the forecast for the field. Cantarell, but in reality, the red line is what has happened. And if we go out to the present time, it's producing about 500,000 barrels a day. It's down to here. Pardon?
Forget Mexico.
It's a problem. This is another slide from Pemex that somebody sent me, and this was done in 2005. You can see the projections for national production. They expected this field to come on stream. They expected to maintain Cantarell's production. They thought they would add reserves from exploration, and they thought they would add reserves from deep water. In fact, their production is going like that. So their engineering program has not worked, and their exploration program has not worked. The people I know who are working as contractors with Pemex indicate that the rocks you need for big oil fields do not exist where Pemex thought they were 10 years ago. Geology is just different. Pemex, as a state entity, has to get its budget from the state. So they send revenues over on Tuesday. On Wednesday, they go back to the government and they say, we have a little bit of that back for investment. And the government allocates them a fraction of what they've sent. This is their history of investment through 2000. I think this is 2000, yeah. So they came to about here, and then their investment stream went like that. But their plan was to get up to $10 billion a year. They have recently gotten up to $10 billion a year, but they've done it on the back of $100 a barrel oil. They did not plan on $100 a barrel oil when they made these projections. They thought they would get this out of $40 a barrel in oil. Okay, $40 a barrel. And so the only good thing you can say about high oil prices is providing more money to the Mexican government. That helps them perhaps to maintain more oil industry and more additional social programs which may create a somewhat more stable country. Some questions about Mexico? Will the Mexican government revive Pemex's capital program? It seems to be doing that. What about production? It's declining. As I say, this last year, the CAPEX expenditure for exploration and production in Pemex was $15 billion. That's an improvement. Okay, let's talk something about the United States that we know about. This is the West Coast. This is Puget Sound. This is where the refineries are, up around Ferndale and Bellingham. This is Alaska and California oil production. 1988, 3 million barrels a day. 2006, down to 1.5 million barrels a day. Today it's about 1 million barrels a day. So it's a secular decline as all these old fields play out. Our refining capacity in 2002 on the West Coast, California, Washington, a little bit in Oregon, not much, was about 2.25 million barrels a day. So we were self-sufficient in oil. In 1996. And since then, to the extent the refineries on the West Coast run at full capacity, it's because the refiners control oil, such as BP's control of Prudhoe Bay, Chevron's control of some California fields. To the extent that they don't have adequate oil for their refineries, they run inefficiently at a small fraction of their design capacity. And this has led to a number of refineries to simply shutter and to close. Shell did this in the Bakersfield area in 2002. When they proposed closing it, a state legislative investigation began, and then Shell was able to sell the refinery pretty much for a song to Valero. Here's where we are today. This is Alaska production and Washington State refining capacity. That's through 2006, and so you can see Alaska's production is heading towards our Washington refining capacity, and our refineries in Washington are all using Alaskan crude. They're not using any other crude at this time. And this is the most recent data, and as you can see, we have just now intersected Washington refining capacity. And so refineries, which 15 years ago were in some cases running at better than 100% design capacity, are now going to be running at less than that because they will not have the crude stock available to them from the North Slope. So, here's a question. Will these marketeers bring refined products to the West Coast rather than crude oil to run through the refineries? Some will. Some will shutter their refineries and bring it from someplace else. I think some refineries will have to close because we'll have the shortfall in crude stocks. Yeah.
We go back one slide.
Yes.
What's the production thought to be in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge or
Zero.
the reserves?
At this time, zero.
No, but I mean, if they did it.
It depends. It depends on who you believe. Oh, it really does. Now, the USGS has made 4 different assessments of the wildlife reserves. And the first one was very optimistic and said it was in the center of the reserve. The most recent one is pessimistic, and they see the reserves, if they exist, to be up on the coastal plain. The numbers have come down by about an order of magnitude. One time it was thought to be another Prudhoe Bay, Kaparic type 15 to 20 billion barrel reserves. Now, if I remember the numbers correctly, their mean estimate is about 3 billion barrels of reserves. If you remember what that curve looked like for the world. Their upside is about 10 billion barrels. Their low side case is a few hundred million. And of course, the Alaskan delegation and Vice President I won't name used to focus on this 10 billion barrel number. What they were focusing on was a probability of 2%. And I wouldn't bet on a horse that only had 2% odds unless I knew something nobody else knew. It's not the basis for policy.
Well, hopefully they'll never get the permission to drill there.
And recent research, we'll come to this in a second. Yes, there we are. Recent research indicates that the Arctic is more likely a gas-prone province than an oil-prone province. So here are some questions to think about for the West Coast. Aside from the refineries closing, what about the oil underneath the Arctic Ocean? We're going to be testing for it as the pack ice melts. Is it going to make a difference? Will it be on the Alaskan shelf, Canadian shelf? And is it, in fact, going to be oil rather than gas? The Arctic Islands, which is just over the international boundary from ANWR in Canada, have been reasonably well tested, and it's a gas province. And the data that I've seen over ANWR and contiguous areas, it's not very much, suggests to me that it's as much a gas province as an oil province. But I haven't done the detailed analysis one needs to do to make an assessment that's useful for policy. That's just an opinion. So that's Alaska. Coming back to the Yates field in Ira Ann. It's Ira and Ann Yates, were the owners of the ranch where this field was discovered.
Really?
Yes. And they were living on the ranch, but they were driving a town which was miles away, but when all these people came to build this oil field, they had reason to build a town with a cafe where the judge and the sheriff and the prosecutor could play dominoes in the afternoon. And they named the town Iran, Texas. Okay, I don't know about these curves. I mean, I like the logistics curve for a single field. It's very heuristic when you want to think about where we're going with oil. But this is the curve for the Yates field. There has been a lot of politics and a lot of economics affecting the production of the Yates field. And I think the future of oil production is much more likely to resemble this kind of curve than a nice bell curve. So my outlook, local responses to peak oil and peak gas are going to dominate energy markets. There is no energy god in the sky that's going to come down and fix it. National sovereignty is going to play a big deal. I think there's no getting around that. I think consumers are going to find a more competitive market as we try to get those kinds of crudes that we need for our particular energy markets. Light crude stocks are going to lag demand. It doesn't look like they are there yet. You know, if Libya comes back on stream next week, we won't worry about that, but in a few years it's very likely they will, unless we have a change in the mix of automobile transportation in the U.S. And in order to meet the projected oil and gas production in 2030, we need about $1 trillion of investment. I don't know where that capital is coming from. OPEC say they are not spending that money. If I can make policy, and I shouldn't because I'm a geologist, I'm not a politician, we ought to conserve a limited hydrocarbon resource. We ought to support research for alternative resources, even if it puts geologists out of business. I'm here to help. And I really think we have to avoid policies that encourage consumption. Which I know disqualifies me from membership in the Republican National Committee. That's the way it goes. Okay, enough of peak oil. Here's a real peak. Thanks very much for your attention. Seconds we got the room for. I'll answer some questions. Yeah.
Jim, could you roughly break down for us the price of the finished product by like exploration and production, refinement?
Well, I really can't because I don't know those numbers. Those numbers are typically held proprietary. You can go on the web and you'll find that they vary by basin and by market. And I can tell you that when I left ARCO 10 years ago, the cost of taking a barrel of oil from the subsurface to the mouth of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, to the inlet pipe for ARCO, this is cradle to grave, sunk cost, was $1.05 a barrel. So at $1.05 a barrel, ARCO was not terribly concerned about $9 a barrel. You had $8 margin with which to send that oil down to Valdez, get it to Puget Sound, run it through a refinery, and get it to a gas station. $9 is a lot of margin to play with. Other operators on the North Slope, their margins were about $4 or $5. Now, looking at the Oil and Gas Journal in the last year, I've seen world average numbers of about $20 a barrel. That's lifting costs. That's what it costs to get it up to the surface. And what happens next? Very much depends on where you are, how far you are to the refinery, what the refinery is set up to do with your crude. And so there's a variation that's quite complicated. Yeah.
My understanding is we currently subsidize the oil industry at about $40 billion a year.
You've been talking to Ginny Burdick? Ginny is a state representative, and I went to a town hall meeting last year where she said something like that. I tried to find out what she meant. There's different kinds of subsidies, right? And what I know about is exploration and production subsidies.
Okay.
And we don't have those in the United States. What we have is a tax and royalty system which charges a certain amount of money per barrel for oil collected offshore. Onshore, if you're on federal land, there's one royalty system. If you're on private land, it's between the oil company and the landholder. When you look at all of our taxes to produce a 100 units of oil, and you compare our oil companies in federal waters with oil companies operating, same oil companies for that matter, operating in the UK or Indonesia, well, the U.S. is a much better place to do business than Indonesia. And as of a change in policy made in the UK 2 weeks ago, this is a much better place to do business than Britain. Now, does that constitute a subsidy? I mean, that's a tax policy. Nobody's paying an oil company to produce oil. Once you get it into the product side, things change. And at that point, I don't have the expertise to address the question.
Thank you.
Yes?
Do you think the price of oil to the consumer is increasing now because of the decreasing production you showed, or is there something else going
I
on?
think something else is going on. You know, I mean, I look at the statistics in terms of crude stocks that are available, crude that's available to be shipped, shipments that are being made. And this is published in the Oil and Gas Journal every day if you can stand it, but I look at it once a week, once a month. There seems to be no shortage of crude. There is certainly a shortage of crude in the Mediterranean, of that light Libyan crude. So they have a local problem. The thing that I don't understand is the role that speculation is playing, especially computer-generated speculation. You know, there are hedgers and speculators that operate in regulated commodity markets, like the NYMEX exchange, or the COMEX exchange, or the London exchange. And there you have to go and register, you have to show capital, you have to report every trade you make, your trades are monitored. In any event that you corner the market, the regulators can come and tell you to unwind your trades. And of course, this is what happened to the Hunt brothers. The Hunt brothers were playing on the NYMEX, the London bullion market, and the COMEX. They cornered the silver market, and these three exchanges got together and told the Hunts to liquidate their positions because they had driven everybody out of the market, and the market was no longer liquid, and the prices were behaving very erratically. And you know, as a result, two of the Hunt brothers effectively went broke. You know, they managed to destroy what would today be tens of billions of dollars of wealth. I don't know what's going on in the crude oil market today because I don't think everything is occurring on these regulated markets with full reporting. I think something else is going on, and it's a problem tracking it. And I don't know where that someplace else is. And I really have no insight to that. Yeah.
You explained that the average barrel of crude being produced is changing from a lighter to a heavier over time. I assume we're not getting a higher increase in demand for asphalt when there's less gasoline to fuel cars. So what happens at the refinery with those products that there isn't enough demand for?
Then the refiners will retweak their refineries and put out another product if there's a market for it. If there isn't, they will simply refine less crude.
So the refineries are engineered to...
They're engineered for the current market. Now you might ask yourself...
So I guess my question is it possible to change the mix of what comes out of the
Oh,
refinery?
absolutely. You can change the mix.
Okay.
There is a cost to be borne.
So it's not just
It'll be
distillation?
It'll be in the physical configuration of the plant, and it will also include feedstocks. If you're going to the heavier crudes, then the process is called upgrading. And what you do with upgrading is you bring in natural gas and you mix it with the crude, and you basically create a lighter crude. And then you run that through the more standard refining process.
Gotcha.
And as there's an abundance of natural gas, this is what they're doing. This is what they propose to do in Canada. This is what they've been doing, amazingly, with coal in South Africa for many years. It's the old Fischer-Tropsch process. But it turns out you can use it on asphalts as well as coal. Basically, it's the same chemistry.
Thank you.
Yes?
I believe what your answer will perhaps answer to the question I'm going to ask you, but I'm going to put it out to you. We've spent a number of years overseas in Europe, Eastern Europe mainly, and the price of diesel at the pump was almost always, in my recollection, cheaper than gasoline. But here in the States, diesel costs more. So, but I think what you were explaining, it just depends on what either the government is trying to achieve.
It depends on where you are.
Yeah.
Once upon a time, diesel was taxed less than gasoline in this country. And that was kind of a subsidy to truckers because we didn't have diesel-powered automobiles for the most part. And then more people bought diesel-powered trucks, pickup trucks, and a certain number of diesel automobiles. And so the government rejigged the diesel tax. But then people in America didn't like diesel automobiles because the acceleration was awful, and the price of oil fell, and so people went back to gasoline engines, right? So you get from 0 to 15, a lot quicker. And now diesel engines, I'm told, I haven't been in one for a long time, they tweak those engines and the mechanics of them so they have comparable acceleration to a conventional gasoline engine. But at this point, the taxing on diesel and gasoline at the federal level is pretty much comparable. State by state, it varies.
So,
Great.
I know you're not a social scientist, you're a geologist. But in the Middle East, where there's a lot of unrest and involves a lot of younger people, is this going to accelerate this sort of internalization of where these countries are going to be putting their resources?
Yeah, I think so. I think, after 2011, because a year later, there was a delegation of faculty from a university in Saudi Arabia. And they came to Portland State, and I had lunch with them one day and lunch with them another day. And they all had their PhDs from the States. And they were running graduate programs in Riyadh. And I asked them, what's the fate of your graduates when they get their doctorates? And they said, well, we don't hire them. They only hire Western European and U.S. research university graduates. I know that in Egypt, they have one engineering school that produces competent engineers. And when I was going to Qatar regularly, all of the engineers there, too, were from Egypt. And the two who weren't from Egypt were Qatari, and they were educated at the Colorado School of Mines. But the faculty I was talking to, they complained about the level of secondary education in Saudi Arabia. It just wasn't good enough that you could take somebody through a PhD program and come out with a research person. And most of these people were in history and sociology or economics and other maritime sciences. So that's a problem that has to be addressed. There's also the unemployment problem, which is just astonishing. In North Africa, I spent 2 weeks in Algiers, and I'm working with the State Oil Company, and I got to know our driver. We had a driver who took us back and forth from the hotel to their offices, and from their offices to a core warehouse where we examined cores and things. And we got along really well. I spoke enough French that he was happy to have me sitting next to him rather than somebody who spoke no French. And after a while, I said, well, where do you live? And he pointed this tall Soviet-style apartment block. And I said, do you live with your wife and children? He said, no, I'm single. I live with my parents. And I said, well, how many siblings do you have? He had a sister, he had 2 brothers. And they had a 1-bedroom apartment. And here's how their life was. He had a job. So at night, he slept in the living room. His sister and his parents slept in the bedroom. His 2 brothers spent the night going around the bars or coffee shops of the Kasbah. And 40% unemployment is the number that I looked up when I got home for adults age 18 to 50. That's horrible.
Yeah.
And the other thing about the Middle East that we don't appreciate if we don't go there is that on Fridays there's one social event. It's down at the neighborhood mosque. There are lots of neighborhood mosques. They all have a little courtyard out front. I was in Algiers just before the election, which resulted in the government declaring the election null in a 10-year civil war. The only place that was comparable to any of those mosques on Friday mornings that we were there were 2 of them, was Sproul Plaza in 1968. People of that age, 18, 19, 20, 22, standing around. The election was going to occur on the following Sunday, the Sunday after we left. There were posters all over the place. There were 2 parties. There was the Islamic Front, and there was the Liberation Front, the FLN. The FLN, of course, was the organization that got rid of the French. The Islamic Front, of course, was the Islamic Party, which was really being promoted by jihadis who come back from the Afghanistan war against the Soviet Union, and it was widely thought that they were well funded by Iran. supporting a national FLN candidate. The FIS candidate posters were every place. You know, so you've got young people that are unemployed. The nexus of their social life is in front of a mosque. And you have a national party which has no way of organizing people because it's not doing anything for them. They seem to be corrupt. You know, that's where this is coming from. Other questions? Yeah.
I have a question, which is how much credence or influence do you think the T-Boons Picken plan, which could be summarized as running large segments of commercial transport on natural gas, how that might affect the consumption curve of gasoline, if anyone in fact adopted such a policy?
I think the big problem with this plan is you have to get a fueling infrastructure in place. And I've heard Pickens talk about this a couple of times in meetings, and he imagines it happening as quickly as cell phone towers have gone up. He really does. He does talk about 8 to 9 year time frames once you've got the subsidies in place, and then you ease the subsidies out. That seems a bit ambitious. The gas is there if you're willing to pay about $6 an M, 1,000 cubic feet or 1,000 BTU. Right now the price is $4 per 1,000 BTU. And I think a lot of the shale gas drilling that we're seeing, which is adding gas reserves to those reported and considered proven in the U.S., is driven by deals, joint venture deals made between different companies on the assumption of the price staying at 5.5 to 6. And I think when all of the obligations that were entailed by these deals have been exhausted in about 2 years, if the price of gas is below 4, a lot of this gas is going to be shut in. Because my understanding is it doesn't make sense to produce it at anything less than 4. And that takes the stakes out of this assumption of gas reserves. You get the price up to 6, it's no problem. Below 6, I'm not sure where the gas comes from. Okay, do we have to give up the room?